Hi Year 12, this is another video on the problem of evil. This is about John Hick's Theodicy, and John Hick, as I mentioned in the last video, presents an adaptation of the Irenaean Theodicy. That's the Theodicy of Irenaeus. So I'm just basically I'm gonna put these slides on Teams, so you could print them out, and I'm just going to talk through them basically, and then you can just add any notes that you might need to around the slides. I don't know how much there will be to add, but maybe bits and pieces. So John Hick wrote this book, Evil and the God of Love, in 1966, where he argues for an Irenaean style theodicy, but he also kind of updates or changes the Irenaean theodicy in a number of ways. So we're going to look at some of the key concepts that are part of John Hick's theodicy. Some of them are changes to Irenaeus, so some of them go against what Irenaeus believed. In other ways, what he does is just kind of uses concepts to clarify. They just kind of help to explain what Irenaeus, how the Irenaean theodicy works. So that's the idea, is that not all of these concepts are necessarily big changes from Irenaeus, although some of them are. Some of them are just like concepts or key terms that he uses to help kind of further explain this kind of theodicy. So the first thing we're going to look at is instrumental good. I think this is not a difference from Irenaeus. I'd say it's just a term that he uses. So he says evil and suffering are instrumental goods. This means they are not good in and of themselves, rather they are good because of the good things they help to bring about. Evil and suffering help us to grow and become better people. So when something's instrumental, it means it can be used for a purpose, for the sake of something else. So an instrumental good is a good that is good because of what it brings about. Hick refers to the world as a veil of soul making. This phrase comes from a letter written by the poet John Keats. So John Keats used that phrase about the world, and he picked it up to help to explain this theodicy. It describes how the world is a place in which our soul can develop by confronting problems and difficulties. So when Irenaeus is described as having a soul-making theodicy, that is John Hick who described it in that way. So here Hick, following Irenaeus, differs from Augustine. They are not saying that evil is not a thing. So they reject the idea that there is no such thing as evil, that evil is just a privation of good. Augustine thinks that we must argue that evil is not a thing in order to maintain the idea of a loving creator God, because God wouldn't create evil. Hick and Irenaeus think that so there's a typo there. That's one thing to change on your notes. Hick and Irenaeus think that evil is a thing created by God, but that it is a thing created with a good purpose. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. The counterfactual hypothesis. So a hypothesis is a theory, and counterfactual means different to the facts. So what does this mean? To support his idea that suffering should be viewed as an instrumental good, hypotheses about what the world would be like without any suffering. John Hick hypothesizes about what the world would be like without any suffering. His conclusion is that without suffering, human beings would not be able to develop morally. And this is a quote that we actually used at GCSE. In a world devoid of dangers to be avoided, we may assume that there would have been virtually no moral development. So his idea of a counterfactual hypothesis is, okay, let's hypothesize, let's have a theory of what the world would be like if it wasn't the way it is. So let's have a look at if we didn't have evil and suffering in the world. Let's imagine a world in which there is no evil and suffering. And his point is there would be no moral development. We would not be able to grow as people to morally develop good qualities in a world without suffering. So here what he's saying basically is, because that's so important, growing as people and developing good qualities, that means that it would actually be worse if God created a world without suffering. Hope that makes sense. Teleological evil. Now, this is an interesting point and something a bit new, I think. A problem with Hick's theory is that not evil seems to serve, or even seems to have the potential to serve, a good purpose. This problem, the problem of teleological evil, so teleological means towards an end or a purpose. Teleological is the opposite. So in other words, this means evil that doesn't seem to have a purpose. So he acknowledges that some evil seems to have no purpose. Instead of ennobling, that means making us better people, affliction, or evil, may crush the character and wrest it from whatever virtues it possessed. So, this is a big problem with an Irenaean style theodicy, is that it's all very well if we just say that all evil is there to help us become better people, and all evil can help you become a better person. But it seems like some evil cannot help you become a better person. Some evil is pointless, doesn't seem to make anyone a better person, and then some evil, it just seems to crush people. Like sometimes people go through such bad situations in life that it's almost impossible to recover from. Psychologically, instead of making you stronger, it makes you completely collapse psychologically. So he acknowledges that's a problem. A partial response might come in the next section. So Hick also says that there are also other reasons why there might be evil in the world, and one is the regularity of nature. He wants to say that actually, yes, evil is that partly why suffering is there is because they're necessary to make us become better people. But there might be some times where you think, well, hold on, God should intervene here. There's no good purpose to this evil. That might be because of this argument, the regularity of nature. So Hick argues that if God stepped in every time there was a possibility of suffering, then nature would have no regularity. E.g., if a knife we use to cut bread is to be of no possible danger to humans, then God must step in whenever humans are at risk of making the knife blunt. So, must step in whenever humans are at risk to make the knife blunt. So the point, here is it would be a completely bizarre world, right? Because we need to have knives to cut food. But there's always the danger that a knife could be used in a bad way. If God was intervening, he would have to kind of break the laws of nature. A sharp knife can cut people. He would have to make it so that it cut the food, but every time it was used on a person, he intervenes and stops it from cutting the food. So basically, if God intervened every time there was any problems, he stopped suffering every time it was possibly going to arise, then we would have a world with no laws of nature, because constantly God would just be breaking those laws of nature to stop suffering. So this creates a world in which people cannot predict and learn from. If God steps in and breaks the laws of nature whenever he needs to prevent suffering, humans will be unable to work out how the world works. This is important for Hick, that if we haven't got laws of nature which are kind of regular, then there's no point us trying to understand how the world works and master the world and try to learn skills that help us to develop in life. And that's important. That's part of what being a human being is about. It's learning from the world, learning how to be better, acquiring the skills that give us give us kind of help us to live. We try to acquire those skills and learn how to cope with the laws of nature. If God stepped in, then that would be gone, and that would be a bad thing. So that might be why sometimes there's pointless suffering that doesn't help us, but it's there because the laws of nature have to stay fixed and God can't keep intervening with them. So there might be some natural disasters which are not there because God thinks we'll learn from them, but because God will never step in to intervene with the laws of nature, because that would be bad for us if we knew God stepped in. So here we go, a bit more on that. According to Hick, this situation would be problematic for two reasons. So here's the two reasons why it's bad for God to intervene the whole time, every time there's danger. Firstly, it prevents humans from developing scientific understanding and improving their knowledge of how the world works. Like I said, that is for Hick an important thing about being human. One thing that God has put us in this world to develop certain characteristics and qualities, and part of that is to develop an understanding of the world so that we can take charge of it and we can reduce suffering in the world. Secondly, and maybe more important, it would mean that humans would not be free to reject God. Such a situation could only be explained by the existence of a benevolent God, and therefore everyone would be aware of God's existence. So his idea is, imagine if nature was the same as it is now, but every time there's any risk of suffering of any kind, God intervened and stopped it. Miraculously it stopped. Now, even if God didn't intervene in a way that we could see him, his point is we would very shortly, after thinking about it for only a couple of days, everyone would become completely aware that there must be a God, because it would seem like it would be too much of a coincidence that every time something bad was going to happen, say someone dropped something from the top of a tall building, then that thing just stopped before it hit someone on the head. Well, we must know that something is interrupting to stop that. If every time an earthquake, a volcano erupted, if the lava spilled over lots of land, but as soon as it came to a house where people lived, the lava kind of miraculously went around the house and didn't harm the house. We must know that God's intervening. So if God's always intervening constantly to stop suffering, then it would be obvious that God exists. This breaks what Hick calls the epistemic distance. Epistemic is to do with knowledge. Epistemic distance between us and God. This epistemic distance is the fact that at the moment, we cannot directly know about God and God's existence. We can only know kind of in an indirect way. And so we don't have complete proof that God is there. Hick argues that God maintains this distance because he wants us to have free will about whether we believe him and whether we believe in and follow God. If his existence was obvious, our choice to believe in him would not be free, and so our decision to follow him would not be worthwhile. So this is important for Hick. He says that one of the things that God is trying to bring about is for human beings to love God and to believe in him and follow him out of their own free choice. If they knew that definitely that God existed, if he was coming down to intervene in the world all the time, they would know he definitely existed, and therefore they wouldn't have any choice in following him, because only a fool would not follow God if he definitely was there, because that God could clearly, it was clearly so all powerful and so all wise that he should be followed, and he may punish you if you don't follow him. So Hick's point is, if God intervened all the time to stop suffering from happening, then we would definitely know he existed, and therefore we would have to follow him. A bit like, we'd be in a bit of the situation of someone who follows a dictator in a country where there's a dictatorship, because we know that if we don't follow and agree with and believe in the dictator, we might get punished or put in prison or killed or whatever. God doesn't want it to be like that. He wants us to have a choice in whether we follow him or not. That would mean that if we did choose to follow him, then there'd be real worth and value in that choice to follow him. So for that reason, he has to make it not obvious that he exists. That he has to make it so that we have to work out his existence and have faith in his existence and follow him based on that faith, because that's freely chosen. If you just make it so it's obvious he exists, faith isn't freely chosen. Okay, I think this is the last one. This is probably the biggest difference, I would say, between Irenaeus and John Hick. Universal salvation. So Irenaeus believed that those who reject God are damned and will go to hell. Hick disagrees with this, and he is a universalist. That means he believes everyone will go to heaven eventually. Now, Hick has several reasons for rejecting hell. Number one, if suffering exists to produce good and make us better people, then the suffering of hell makes no sense. People in hell are not punished so they can grow and develop. Their suffering is eternal, and there is no hope of redemption. That's one reason. If we're explaining all suffering in terms of how it can make us better people, then hell makes no sense, because it can't make you a better person. There's no way that you can get out of hell and then leave a happy life afterwards. As we have seen, this is the second one. Some suffering seems too harsh to allow people to develop morally. It is soul-breaking rather than soul-making. Hick argues that the unfair distribution of this kind of suffering means that it will be unfair to give people only this one life to develop their soul. Hick suggests that after death, those who have not developed into the likeness of God will go to a purgatory-like place in which they will be given further opportunities to develop their soul. So what's he saying? He's basically saying, look, imagine someone who gets such a lot of difficulties in their life that they're not able to grow into the likeness of God. So imagine, you hear these harrowing stories of people who sent to concentration camps at the ages of, 10, 11, 12. They suffer an incredible amount of suffering there, and then they die a few years later. Now, if that happened, it's unlikely that person would be able to recover from that suffering and develop their soul. That soul is likely to, in many cases, that kind of suffering can be soul breaking rather than soul making. It destroys the person. They lose their sense of justice and their sense of fairness about the world. They are unable to. They're not able to look back at this and say, I learned from that process of suffering. All they see it as is something that's haunted their lives, maybe given them extensive psychological problems afterwards, and so on and so on. Now, what Hick is saying here is that, yes, some people get a few challenges in life, and therefore it's quite easy for them to develop a good qualities. Some people, on the other hand, get so much suffering put on their shoulders that it's impossible for them to, in their lifetime, use that suffering to develop all these good qualities. It's just too much for them. If you think about, maybe, I don't know, someone's been in a war and developed post-traumatic stress. Well, those people can sometimes, it's actually made them a worse person afterwards. They went to war, they saw these terrible things, and afterwards they could suffer from anger issues. They could suffer from an inability to trust people, various kind of psychological mental health problems that mean that they find it difficult to deal with other people. So it can sometimes be suffering, soul breaking, something that makes you a worse person afterwards, not a better person. Now, what Hick is saying is that's unfair. If God is just saying, right, if God is sending, if God is letting someone suffer terribly like that, and then because they didn't become a better person, they go to hell and they die, that's unfair. It just doesn't seem fair when other people are getting these tiny challenges. So, someone's being crushed with suffering all their life, and then because they don't respond to that suffering in an amazing way, they get made to suffer more in hell. It seems unfair. So therefore Hick, and there's no evidence for this in biblical sources or anything, but he comes up with his own idea. It says a purgatory-like place. It's not quite like purgatory in the Catholic sense, but it's a bit like that. So it's basically, he thinks there must be another place where people go after they die if they haven't quite grown into the likeness of God, if they haven't quite developed all those perfections they're trying to perfect. And what will happen to there is they will be given further opportunities to develop their soul. So that means they will be put in a situation where, that it's almost like a reincarnation or a new rebirth in a different place where there's more suffering, and they're given further opportunities to use that suffering to grow into better people. And that happens until they have become finally perfect beings and they've perfected all their qualities, and then when they die after that, they'll go to heaven. So that's Hick's idea. It's very controversial amongst Christians because it's not something in the Bible, but Hick believes that it's the only that would make sense to help this, only that situation. Well, that's the situation that would be needed. That would need to be true for the theodicy to make sense. Because on its own, he says, soul-making theodicy is good and correct, he believes, but it doesn't explain all evil. And it doesn't, there's lots of things that it can't explain. For example, like I said, why some people get sent this massive amount of suffering, which doesn't seem to help them become a better person. And Hick's solution is, well, yes, but those people must be given another opportunity. So God is still good and loving because he is giving people another opportunity to develop their soul and finally reach heaven. Okay, I hope that makes sense. That's everything for Hick. Next video is going to be an evaluation of Hick, so saying what the problems are Hick are. Like I said before, the essays are likely to focus on Hick rather than Irenaeus. So Irenaeus is used really as the background to Hick, and then we criticize Hick, but in doing so, we also criticize the ideas that he shares with Irenaeus, if that makes sense. Okay, thanks a lot.